So in the last session, we talked about the benefits of moving to Citrix Workspace, how it allows for more innovation and flexibility. At the same time, it reduces the admin overhead of maintaining an environment.
Yeah, and even though I know that most of our customers are aware of all the benefits that they get from moving to the cloud, some of them are still hesitant, right? So whether that's for whatever reason that may be. And so today we have invited Dan Morgan, and he's going to talk about some of the concerns that customers have and how to address those. So welcome, Dan.
Thanks for having me today. Excited to talk to everybody.
Of course. So Dan, I'm sure as an enterprise architect, you hear firsthand a lot of concerns, right? And you probably hear a lot more than we do from a moving to the cloud perspective. So could you share with us today kind of like what you're seeing and how customers are addressing these concerns to actually make the move to cloud?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say there's a lot of various issues or concerns that may be specific to one customer or another, and there are a lot of different permutations of that, but one common theme that I see generally is more around the approach that's taken to doing migrations involving SaaS products and PaaS products as well, which requires a bit of a different approach versus what you may have been used to in a traditional every 3 to 5 years have a new software release type of development model. Before I get into some of the specific challenges, I kind of wanted to dive into that a little bit for some background, just to kind of set the stage in terms of how I like to think about deployments. One thing that I think everybody knows at this point is that the reality of the matter is that the software development, release, and delivery modalities have shifted as companies like Citrix have shifted from more of a perpetual model to a SaaS model, and as new applications continue to be developed as SaaS services. One key facet of that is that there's an increased cadence of releases. So even for our on-prem products, we have a CR release track available for customers with quarterly releases, and then our cloud products are iterating even faster than that. But the one effect of that is that has also drastically changed the timing of feature introduction. So whereas previously, every 3 to 5 years when you'd have a major release where you'd have a big set of features that come as part of that you might have some minor modifications to with maybe a feature pack here and there, but that's pretty much what you have to work with throughout the life cycle of that particular product until the next release comes. Whereas in the model that we're in now with SaaS and more of a continuous delivery pipeline release methodology, instead you get small changes but occurring frequently over a period of time. So where that also cascades down to then is the deployment approach that you have to take to be successful, because in the 3 to 5 year major release model, you could plan very linearly because you have a specific set of capabilities that exist today and come out of the box with the product, and effectively you're developing a plan around those constraints, noting that it's going to be a significant period of time before that set of capabilities changes. Whereas in the model where features are continually being released, it makes it a bit more conducive to taking more of an agile approach where linear planning is not being done in the same sense. Additionally, I think another common thing that I sort of refer to is kind of like the roadmap trap, which is basically where you're always looking at the next thing in the roadmap as the thing that's going to enable you to achieve kind of that nirvana state of that vision that you have in your mind. So I think really the way to account for a lot of this is by building a culture of iteration and innovation, which is going to allow you to operate in that more flexible deployment model and achieve your goals a little bit differently. So there are a few foundational axioms that I like to look at as sort of core principles that you need to acknowledge to successfully operate in that model. So first, achieving a technical vision is going to take a series of changes that you're going to have to go through iteratively to accomplish that goal. Noting that the implementation of those series of changes isn't necessarily going to happen overnight, but are a set of steps that are ultimately building towards that longer term vision, with each step adding a different set of values and capabilities to your solution, having a different level of effort associated with taking that step, and a different degree of risk involved with making that particular change. I think the final thing that's really important to acknowledge as part of going through that is that so-called nirvana state is going to evolve over time as business challenges that you're trying to address are changing, and also as your vision may be influenced by new capabilities that are introduced over the life cycle of the deployment that you weren't necessarily anticipating at earlier stages.
And I think, Dan, this is interesting that you mentioned this whole changing of culture, right? Because I think our traditional Citrix customers, they were so focused and they spent so much time on that maintenance and that upgrades. And it was a huge upgrade, right? Like you said, it was usually like they did it maybe once a year, if that, right? Where they waited for all these features to accumulate before they did their next upgrade. And that took a lot of time and effort. And I remember some of the things that I heard in the field was, what am I going to do now, right? Like now that I'm not in this constant maintenance mode and planning for the next release, because by the time you finish an upgrade, you're already behind type of thing. I like how you mentioned that it's a whole culture change and a whole change of now you can focus on innovation. Now you can focus on a different vision, right? Because now you have the time to do that. So I like how you phrased that.
Yeah, and really, I think that taking that iterative mindset is probably the biggest differentiator of what I see as far as customers who are successful in their cloud journeys versus customers who are lagging behind on progress in that facet. And making sure that you adjust your methodology accordingly, it definitely requires a shift.
Yeah, I think aside from the benefits of admins not having to do these big, long change controls, that it gives them more time to train users internally on those incremental features instead of trying to teach like this, a few years of features. It's incremental, and then they can actually, spend more time, and there's more adoption of those features.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. And I think that's definitely one of the exciting things from a cloud standpoint, where effectively, you're taking tasks that are not fun. Like, I don't think anybody who's ever worked in IT has been amped like, oh yes, I get to patch my delivery controllers, and I'm going to have a fun change control window with my SQL team at 2 a.m. As you're kind of shifting though over into that type of implementation methodology, I think there are a couple of key things that are important to think about as you're going through that. So first, everything needs to be thought about in terms of milestones, where you're taking a bigger picture vision, which is longer term. For example, you want to not be managing any type of control plane components. You want your workloads in Azure, and you're going to be able to completely be operating with Citrix Workspace and Gateway Service. If you're coming from a large on-prem or largely on-prem environment, that is a big shift from conceptually, architecturally, and getting there. And I think a lot of times I see customers sort of getting stuck on, where do I start? There's a lot of independent things I need to do. So I think that breaking down a complex problem like that into smaller consumable milestones is really important. A key thing to do here, and I'll tie into this a little bit later, is thinking about looking at things per cloud service, and also even breaking it down into smaller units than that. Like maybe you can approach it, a data center at a time. If you're making a migration to virtual apps and desktop service, Or maybe you want to start with getting rid of your WEM implementation and shifting up to WEM service as an initial step, which is going to be a starting point that's less that's going to involve changing less procedures on your operational side. But there are a lot of ways to break things down. But I think figuring out that set of milestones that's ultimately going to get you to your longer term vision is key. Second piece is being creative as you're going through the process, because there are often alternate ways to solve similar problems, particularly if you run into something where there's a feature that doesn't exist in the product today that you think should. Like a big example of that was, early on in MCS, when in Azure, when the identity disk, you wanted to use premium storage, and the identity disks were getting created with that same tier, and you just wanted to use standard SSDs. Could you do it? Yes. Do you have to do? You had to do some scripting, but now that that capability has been added to where you can use the standard SSDs for your identity disk, whereas using the premium SSD for the machine that's created. So just as an example, like there are often multiple ways to solve the same problem, and you need to be looking for those constantly, particularly noting that the products are going to be continually evolving and potentially making that situation better for you. The second thing is like on the element of practicality. I think this goes back to that roadmap trap. It's great to know that there are constantly features that are coming down the pipeline and are going to benefit you, but you have to design for your initial steps on the reality of what exists today, making sure that you're capturing value for that, because that's always going to be necessary to set you up to take advantage of some of the future improvements. And then finally, as you're making changes more rapidly, it's going to be important to communicate early and often when you're making changes so you can highlight those values. So thinking a little bit then, if you do run into a standpoint where your cloud project is blocked, there are a couple of key things I like to look at with my customers to help them figure out what is a tangible next step to continue moving things forward. So first, is a challenge visible to end users that's holding you up? If the answer is no, I find that a lot of the time that some sort of accommodation or short-term process change can be made to overcome that until you're able to implement a technical capability that would eliminate those challenges. And I think that in general, if there's a non-end user facing obstacle that's holding up a longer term IT project that is supposed to deliver specific benefits to a business or a workflow, it's never a good look from a management standpoint to have non-end user facing things holding things up. So that's something that is an area for creativity. Secondly, is it possible to overcome the challenge by doing something differently? A really common one that I ran into with customers when they were looking at adopting Workspace at some point, but maybe had a really complex authentication scenario that they wanted to take advantage of, and they wanted to leverage native authentication capabilities of Workspace that couldn't necessarily accomplish their exact thing. That, to me, should have not really been a blocker for many of our customers, because you can always temporarily leverage Citrix ADC for performing that authentication, which at that point with N-Factor, you can make it do whatever you want. But the third piece is, does the challenge that you're facing apply to all end users and scenarios? I think this comes up a lot with access to your related items, where you don't necessarily have the same set of requirements across all sets of users and all access scenarios. So one key example of that would be that some users may be used to a browser-based access flow versus going natively through the Workspace app. And a particular capability that you're looking to implement requires functionality natively built into the Workspace app. So that said, there may be some user groups where their workflow does involve the native Workspace app already, and it can be a non-issue for at least implementing the feature for that pocket of users. And oftentimes I see customers holding up implementing a new capability because it doesn't achieve what they want to achieve for every single user community. But again, in sort of this iterative approach, that can actually be okay. And it doesn't make sense to not start showing value or additional security or additional flexibility for one community of users just because the method that you have to implement it today doesn't do it equally across all the different user communities. And then the final thing I like to look at is, are there incremental steps I can take before the challenge will manifest itself at all? And I think oftentimes this is one where thinking about the traditional IT project approach that's more linear, you think, okay, well, 3 steps down the line, I know I'm going to run into a certain limitation based on existing capabilities. So we're going to halt the project until we know that our efforts are going to come to fruition. But again, in this case, there are often multiple steps that you can take that are going to continue moving you forward to where you're looking to go. So a few things just to kind of loop back to that I think are important is time to value is really important to consider. So I think another key thing to highlight here is that establishing capabilities to sort of be able to iterate and get feedback on things is going to be really important. So some of my customers have done that through some sort of like .next environment where essentially you have the latest and greatest of the full solution stack that you're using, where essentially you're giving, let's call it IT friendlies, access to sort of the latest and greatest of everything across the boards. So you can get early feedback on newer capabilities you might be testing, or even gain some operational knowledge of implementing new IT-centric features, and really how to manage that from a hands-on standpoint as you implement that with effectively a group of people who are interested in moving technology forward. To kind of tie things up, just a couple of key examples I think are really important where taking that iterative approach could have really helped. So first is really on those access to your scenarios, because I've had a lot of customers who have delayed going in the direction of workspace, for example, because they were in a scenario where leveraging the localhost cache functionality with their on-prem access tier was critical for the success of certain use cases. On the other hand, if customers then did not take that first step and get things in the virtual apps and desktop service, as that first step, that was a necessary initial step then to be able to take advantage of our new service continuity features and functionality that was recently rolled out, which again provides some resiliency in the event of service disruption or connectivity disruption to workspace, which can enable more use cases to be rolled out on workspace for many customers. Another element, on the virtual apps and desktops, the virtual apps and desktop service side, I think at this point, I have not found at this point, many compelling technical blockers at this point from a features and functionality standpoint that would really prevent customers from going one to the other. But if for the customers who've been investing and making that transition, that they've been rewarded by the new Web Studio experience, which, for people like me who've been complaining about MMC for the last 10 years, that's definitely a big step up. And then finally, just circling back to the workloads in public cloud with MCS, I mean, we've made some substantial enhancements to MCS in public cloud, especially in Azure, but also with doing a lot of great things in the GCP space and some in the AWS space as well. Where again, there have been significant improvements that I think are setting the stage for even more to come. But today, the fact now that we can deploy to different availability zones within Azure is a huge boon for customers who are making those public cloud transitions. And additionally, things like the Azure Shared Image Gallery make it a lot simpler to facilitate global MCS deployments, where you're looking at public cloud as potentially a benefit to making it easier to drop in workloads into different geos that may make more sense for different user communities. So, I think that, again, just in sum, I think building that iterative mindset, getting technologies out there and really working with them is going to be absolutely critical to making things happen.
Yeah, no, thanks, Dan. We really appreciate you coming on. And I think if there's one thing that, customers can take away from this session is, even if you looked at this service 18, 24 months back, and there was a specific technical blocker that was preventing you to move to the cloud, I think it's now time to relook at it, right? Because those gaps have been closed. And like you said, and you're in the field all the time with huge customers who have different challenges. I think at this point, there shouldn't be a technical blocker that prevents you from moving to the cloud. It's more changing that mindset. So we really appreciate you coming on, and thanks, Dan.